I remember the exact moment I felt my life teeter on the edge of something forbidden. It was a blazing hot afternoon in late July. I was standing by the living room window, half-heartedly wiping away dusty fingerprints, when I saw him step out of a sleek black car across the street. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall and confident, with a gaze so magnetic I felt it through the glass. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met, mine shadowed by nearly 6 decades of life, his glowing with youth and vitality, and I felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through me. I should have turned away right then, reminding myself that I was a happily married woman of 62. But I didn't. I kept looking. My name is Claudia, and until that moment, I believed my life was steady. I'd been married to George for over 35 years, raised 2 children who were now living in different states, and spent my days in quiet routines, gardening, reading romance novels, attending local community meetings. George worked in corporate finance, leaving the house early each morning and returning late, always weary. For years we existed in a comfortable rhythm, little affection, but little conflict. I'd grown used to a subdued life, convinced that real passion was something for the young or for the past. That day, though, something inside me stirred. Perhaps it was the oppressive heat or the glint of his dark hair under the sun. Maybe it was the easy way he strode across the driveway, nodding hello to my next-door neighbor. All I knew was that watching him made me feel awake, as if I were shaking off a long, dull sleep. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, saw the faint flush on my cheeks, and told myself it was just the warmth of the afternoon. That was the first lie. By the end of that week, I learned that his name was Luke. He was 34 and had recently moved into the neighborhood, renting a place diagonally across the street. I spotted him carrying boxes into that little blue house with the overgrown lawn. Each time I passed, I made a point to wave politely. He'd smile in return, an unguarded, friendly smile that quickened my pulse. The following Monday, I saw him struggling to drag a couple of garbage bins to the curb, and I used that as my excuse to introduce myself. Leaving my half-washed dishes in the sink, I hurried out the door, feigning a casual stroll. As I approached, I offered to help, and he thanked me with an amused grin, joking that I was too kind to do the dirty work. "Everyone's got to haul trash sometime," I laughed, though my heart was thudding. "I'm Claudia, by the way, your new neighbor." His smile widened. "Luke, it's good to meet you, Claudia." He extended his hand, and I shook it, feeling his warm skin against mine. An electric tension hummed in that brief contact, and I withdrew my fingers before it showed on my face. I could practically feel my conscience tugging at me, but I brushed it aside, telling myself I was simply being neighborly. That evening, I mentioned Luke to George over dinner. He gave a non-committal grunt, barely looking up from his phone, which was flashing with after-hours emails. Typical. I tried to spark conversation, telling him about how Luke had just moved here for work, how he seemed pleasant, how maybe we could invite him over sometime. George shrugged, drained the last of his coffee, and disappeared into the study to finish a report. A familiar dull ache settled in my chest. We'd become so distant, so wrapped in our separate worlds. It was no wonder a moment of human warmth from a younger man had managed to affect me so profoundly. Within a few days, Luke and I had established an easy acquaintance. We'd chat on the sidewalk if we happened to run into each other, or exchange pleasantries when I spotted him jogging in the early mornings. Our conversations started out harmless, just the usual talk of weather, local restaurants, how to navigate the city. But my heart always fluttered when he called my name, or when I caught a playful spark in his eyes. One sweltering afternoon, I saw him wrestling with a heavy-looking box by his front door. Without thinking, I marched across the street to help. We ended up carrying the box inside together. It turned out to be a new coffee table, still boxed up and waiting to be assembled. His place was charming but sparse, filled with unopened crates of books, a lone couch, and a makeshift dining table. Dust motes floated in the rays of sunlight streaming through half-covered windows. "Sorry it's such a mess," he said, clearing a spot for me to step. "Between work and everything else, I've barely had time to settle in." "Oh, it's fine," I assured him, an edge of curiosity creeping into my voice. "I remember moving here decades ago with my husband. We had boxes everywhere for weeks." He nodded politely. "You've been here a while, huh?" "Over 20 years in this house," I said, smiling. "Let me know if you need any recommendations for furniture shops or anything else. I'd be happy to help." I tried to keep my tone light and neighborly, but an unspoken tension thickened the air. Maybe it was my imagination, but the way his gaze settled on me felt more intense than casual conversation warranted. Trying to break the moment, I offered to help him assemble the coffee table. We ended up kneeling side by side on the living room floor, sorting through screws and small wooden dowels, talking about music, movies, and how we both enjoyed reading. He seemed genuinely interested in my stories, about how I once dreamed of being a writer, how I'd sacrificed that dream to focus on family. Whenever I looked up, his eyes locked on mine, and I felt that same uneasy flutter in my chest. Time slipped by, and before I knew it, the table was done, the sun sinking low outside. I stood up, dusting my jeans. "I'd better get going," I mumbled. "My husband will be home soon." Luke walked me to the door, and as I turned to leave, he said something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Thanks again, Claudia. I really like talking with you." His voice was quiet. "You make this neighborhood feel less lonely." His words lingered in my mind all night, echoing through the silence of my bedroom as George slept beside me, oblivious to my turmoil. I told myself to push the thought away, to focus on my marriage. But my heart wouldn't listen. I found myself replaying Luke's smiles, the gentle timbre of his voice, the press of his shoulder against mine as we turned the coffee table upright. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, yet I couldn't deny the flicker of life it brought back into me. A few days later I caught Luke coming home from work. He wore a crisp shirt, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened around his neck, and carried a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. We met in the middle of the street, exchanging small talk about the heat wave. At some point, I mentioned that I had to run errands downtown, and he said he was heading in the same direction. We ended up driving together in his car. It felt oddly intimate to be alone with him in a closed space, the air conditioner humming, windows shut to the scorching outside world. Our conversation flowed easily, laced with subdued excitement. At a red light, I felt his gaze flick toward me. When our eyes met, my breath caught for a moment. We parked in a busy lot near a small cluster of shops. I was planning to pick up a few things from a bookstore, and Luke said he'd join me. "I love a good bookstore," he told me, smiling as he locked the car. "It's rare to find people who still appreciate physical books these days." Inside, the store's cool air and faint smell of paper was a welcome respite from the blistering heat. We browsed side by side, occasionally pointing out interesting covers or authors we'd read. At one point, he grabbed a book from a high shelf for me, leaning in so close I could sense his warmth. Our hands brushed as he passed it to me, and a subtle thrill rippled through my entire body. I forced myself to keep it light, but my heart pounded so fiercely I was sure he could hear it. We checked out, and as we stepped back into the sun, he suggested we grab a cold drink at the cafe next door. I almost said no. I could see the potential danger in letting the day drift on with him, an unspoken chemistry simmering. Yet I agreed. I wanted more time in his company, rationalizing that a quick drink wouldn't harm anyone. We settled at a small outdoor table under a big umbrella, each sipping iced coffee. He loosened his tie further, exhaling in relief, and I found myself staring at the light sheen of sweat on his neck. We chatted about little things, his new job in project management, my years as a homemaker, my half-abandoned hobbies. The conversation felt friendly, but there was an undercurrent of tension that refused to fade. At one point he reached across the table, brushing something off my cheek. "A speck of dust," he said softly. My entire body tensed, every nerve ending on alert. His touch was so small, so fleeting, yet so electric that I thought I might forget how to breathe. My mind screamed at me to pull back, to keep my distance, to keep this moment from escalating. But I sat there, paralyzed by the unexpected rush of longing. Hours later, as I sat at home staring at the groceries I'd barely remembered to buy, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "It's Luke. Hope you got home safe. Thanks for today. I had a great time." My stomach flipped. I saved the number, hesitated, then sent a quick reply. "It was fun, thank you. Have a good evening." That was it, just a polite line. But my fingertips tingled and my heartbeat roared. The following week, George went out of town for a 3-day conference. Normally, I'd fill my hours with chores or perhaps a new knitting project, but I couldn't stop thinking about Luke. We texted sporadically, nothing overt, just short notes about daily life. Late one night, as I sat alone on the couch, I found myself craving the sound of his voice. On an impulse, I called him. He picked up on the second ring, sounding surprised and pleased. We talked for nearly an hour, the conversation meandering through topics like our favorite songs, the toughest hardships we'd faced, where we wanted to travel someday. It was startlingly intimate, and by the time I hung up, I was trembling. I realized I wanted more than just conversation. I wanted that heat in his eyes, that closeness I felt in the bookstore. The next day he texted me around noon. "Lunch break? I'm at a cafe near the office if you're free." My mind whirled with excuses. Housework, errands, the risk of being seen. But loneliness and curiosity won out. I drove to the cafe, feeling a fluttery nervousness in my gut. We ordered sandwiches and sat at a corner table in hushed conversation, leaning in to hear each other over the lunch crowd. At some point, his leg brushed mine under the table, and neither of us moved away. A flush of warmth shot through me. The tension soared. It was at that moment that I let the final thread of caution slip away. I glanced around. Nobody I knew was in sight. Then I reached over, my hand softly covering his. Our eyes met, and there was an undeniable spark, a silent agreement that we were crossing into new territory. "Luke," I said quietly, my voice trembling, "what are we doing?" He exhaled, turning his hand to hold mine more securely. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I haven't felt this alive in a long time." So we let ourselves fall. After finishing lunch, he walked me to my car, parked in a side lot. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, but I barely felt it over the pounding of my heart. We stood by the driver's side door, our bodies so close the heat seemed to radiate between us. Then he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine in a long, lingering kiss. My mind spun with guilt, excitement, and a desperate hunger for more. It felt like 1,000 fireworks going off under my skin, both exhilarating and terrifying. I left in a daze, windows rolled down, trying to cool the torrent of emotions swirling inside me. I couldn't believe what I had done. I was a married woman, kissing a man nearly 30 years younger. Yet I couldn't stop the rush of adrenaline, or the memory of his hands on my waist as he drew me closer. The lines had been blurred, and some part of me didn't want to go back. For the next few weeks, we continued in a whirlwind of stolen moments and half-kept secrets. We'd meet for coffee in out-of-the-way places, or talk late into the night on the phone, sharing confessions and jokes in hushed tones. Neither of us openly labeled what was happening. We were too caught up in the rush of it all. He'd text me sweet messages in the morning that made my heart flutter, and in the evenings I'd sneak out for short walks, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. In quiet corners, his living room, my driveway, occasionally the shadowy end of a park after dark, we'd kiss with a kind of reckless abandon, as though time would stop for us. The sensation of being wanted like this was overwhelming, reawakening feelings I believed had died with age and routine. Still, guilt gnawed at me. I'd lie in bed next to George, who sometimes slept without even saying good night, and wonder if I could somehow salvage my marriage. But that question only grew more complicated each time Luke and I exchanged a charged glance or shared a breathless kiss. We hadn't slept together, yet the intensity was already scorching my senses. I both craved him and feared what we were becoming. Eventually, reality caught up to me when George's conference schedule slowed down, and he started paying closer attention. He noticed I seemed distracted, that I was out of the house more often. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, he asked, "Are you okay, Claudia? You've been distant." I nearly dropped my fork. My mind scrambled for excuses, but I managed a weak laugh. "I'm just restless, I guess. This heat is getting to me." He gave me a long, probing look, but didn't press further. That night I tossed and turned, haunted by the knowledge that my husband, who had shared my bed for decades, was starting to sense I was slipping away. And still, I could not pull myself out of the undertow of Luke's allure. It all escalated when George left for another business trip. Luke texted me, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I accepted without thinking. My heart pounded as I walked across the street, letting myself into his house for the first time at night. The living room was still sparse, but he'd tidied up, and a soft lamp glowed in the corner. He'd cooked spaghetti, simple but thoughtful. We ate by the dim light, talking in hushed voices. I sipped a single glass of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my veins, loosening my inhibitions. After dinner we drifted to the couch, our conversation trailing off into quiet murmurs. Eventually his hand found mine. I felt him squeeze gently, as though asking permission for what we both knew was coming. My pulse throbbed in my throat. The moment I nodded, he leaned in, capturing my lips with a hunger more intense than ever before. This time, we didn't stop at a kiss. His hands slid along my sides, his warmth igniting fires across my skin. My own hands tangled in his hair, and I found myself trembling, both wanting and fearing the next step. I won't go into explicit detail, but that night we crossed the boundary we'd been dancing around for weeks. It was a swirl of stolen desire, breathy whispers, and a kind of raw emotion I had never experienced, not even in my youth. It felt as if an entire world had been locked away inside me, and Luke was the key. In the aftermath, tangled together under the lamplight, I felt both euphoric and horrified at what I'd done. Here I was, a wife of 35 years, lying in another man's arms. Shame mingled with an odd sense of triumph. I'd found passion again, real, searing passion, but at what cost? Slipping out of his house in the early hours of the morning, I glanced around like a criminal, heart hammering as I darted back into my own home. The house was silent, the bed still made. Nobody would have known I was gone. In the shower, I scrubbed at my skin as though trying to erase the evidence, but the memory wouldn't wash away. Every inch of me felt alive, and simultaneously I was suffocating under guilt. Over the next few days, Luke and I were careful. No open displays, no more public outings together. But behind closed doors, in secret texts and phone calls, we indulged in a closeness that fed my starving heart. I noticed new changes in me. I laughed more, put on dresses I hadn't worn in years, and even started wearing light makeup again. George commented that I seemed happier, perhaps assuming I'd found a new hobby. The irony gnawed at me. If only he knew what had truly reignited my spark. Of course, such deceptions can't last forever. Suspicion grows like ivy, creeping into the cracks. One afternoon, George came home early. I was on the phone with Luke, laughing quietly at something he'd said. At the sound of the front door unlocking, I panicked and hung up. But George stepped into the living room in time to see the worry in my eyes and the phone clutched in my hand. He frowned. "Who were you talking to?" I fumbled for an answer. "Just a friend. No one important." My face felt hot, my voice too high. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded false. George's stare hardened. In that moment, I realized I was about to lose control of the delicate illusions I'd built. The unraveling happened swiftly. George scrolled through my call history while I protested weakly. He recognized Luke's number, not from memory, but because the frequency of calls stood out. His hands trembled, his jaw tense. He didn't explode in rage. There was something worse in his eyes. Heartbreak. "Is this real?" he asked, voice shaking. Are you cheating on me with that man across the street?" Tears blurred my vision. I tried to muster some denial, but the truth was too obvious. "George, I'm so sorry," I choked. "I never meant for this to happen." His expression was more devastation than fury, as if the ground had crumbled beneath him. In a shaky voice he muttered, "I need to get out of here," then snatched his keys and stormed out the door. My stomach twisted in knots. I'd spent so many nights feeling lonely next to him, and now I was the one who had torn our life apart. That night Luke texted me, but I ignored it. I couldn't face him, couldn't face the chaos I'd unleashed. In a panic I tried calling George, leaving tearful voicemails, but he didn't respond. Hours went by in anguished silence. By dawn I realized the life I'd known for decades might be gone forever. Over the following days, George refused to come home. Our kids, living out of state, began calling me to ask why Dad was sleeping on a friend's couch. I didn't have the courage to tell them the truth, only that we were working through something. As guilt pressed in on me like a weight I couldn't lift, I thought about Luke and felt torn. Part of me yearned for his reassurance, the warmth I'd found in his arms, but another part recognized that I had to confront the wreckage I'd made of my marriage. Eventually, George agreed to meet me at a neutral place, a deserted picnic spot by the lake where we used to bring the kids when they were small. I drove there with trembling hands, my breath shallow. When I saw him in the distance, looking broken and unsure, tears threatened to spill. We sat on a bench, the water lapping gently at the shore. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally he asked, "Why, Claudia? Why him? Why now?" His voice was raw, weighted with a grief I couldn't bear to witness. I tried to explain my loneliness, how we'd drifted apart, how in Luke I found a spark that reminded me of a younger version of myself. But it sounded hollow, even to my own ears. George shook his head, tears glistening. "We could have talked," he said. "You could have said something instead of this." I broke down, apologizing over and over, though I knew sorry wasn't enough. By the end of that wrenching conversation, we decided to try counseling, though George made it clear he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive me. That night I sent Luke a final message. "I need time away. I have to fix my marriage if it's possible. Please respect that." It felt like slicing open my heart, but I hit send, then blocked his number before I lost my resolve. So here I am now, piecing my life back together. It's been weeks since I last spoke with Luke. I still see his car sometimes, parked across the street, and my chest tightens with the memory of what we shared. George came home, but there's a wounded distance between us. We started therapy, painful sessions full of anger, tears, and confessions about how we each felt invisible in our marriage. It's too soon to say if we'll survive this. Some days, I see a flicker of hope. Others, I feel the sting of George's resentment, and the shame of my betrayal crushes me. I share my story not because it's admirable, but because it's real. I learned that passion doesn't die with age. It can flare up at the most inconvenient time, and if you let it, it can burn down everything you've built. If there's any lesson here, it's that the slow fade of a marriage can be reversed, but only if you're brave enough to speak your needs before seeking them elsewhere. By the time I recognized my loneliness, it was too late. I found something explosive and thrilling, yet built on a foundation of deceit. I'm Claudia. I was lost in the routine of a quiet life, unprepared for the way a single spark could ignite a storm of desire. Now I live with the aftermath, trying to heal wounds I inflicted on the man I once vowed to love above all else. Love can be fragile, even after decades, and sometimes all it takes to unravel it is one scorching afternoon, a neighbor's friendly smile, and the rush of forbidden longing that follows.